Okay, so as some of you might know, I'm Joe again. Hi, and this is another political video. Right. Well, following the general election, there's been a lot of talk about how unfair the voting system is, because obviously we have FPTP, which is first past the post, and so the Conservatives got in, despite the fact that a lot of the country hadn't exactly voted for them. I mean, UKIP, who I think under if we translate votes cast into seats, should now be the third biggest party in government. However, they only have one seat. So, this video is going to be about the advantages and disadvantages of first past the post, and I'm going to be focusing on proportional representation, but as an alternative. But of course, there are a lot of different alternatives. Now, one of the advantages of first past the post is that it does provide a clearer choice for voters between two different parties. Because, I mean, in most FPTP systems, there are two main parties. I mean, arguably, in this one, until the Lib Dems came in, we had Labour and Conservative. Now, that is a good thing, because, I mean, you have one which embodies a certain number of principles, like a party of, as Labour could be called a party of the left, and then you've got the Conservatives, which are a party of the right. That was right. So yeah, and it also provides an alteration of power. So you have like a right side party in government for a couple of years, then you've got a left side. So it keeps laws up to date, I suppose. Now it also gives rise to single party governments, meaning coalitions are less likely. So that's good because it provides majority cabinets, and I mean arguably one of the problems with the coalition cabinet is the fact that you can have like a kind of stagnation, because the minority coalition partner can hold the majority coalition party to ransom. The other thing with first past the post is it gives rise to coherent opposition. So obviously, when the Conservatives are in government, Labour, or the second largest party, are officially the official opposition. So, and I mean, with proportional representation, you don't get that. It also, and I mean, one of the obvious advantages is the fact that it's simple to use and understand. Because I mean, you've literally got to research the parties, and there aren't that many. Like within a first past the post system, there aren't that many who are like, yeah. And obviously, you then tick the box, and I mean, researching them is fairly easy. Now, onto the disadvantages. I have got notes here. So onto the disadvantages is obviously the biggest disadvantage is that it excludes smaller parties from fair representation. So, and I mean, within a democracy, that's a big thing, because effectively you're silencing their voices, and in a democracy that shouldn't be happening. Going on from that, it also excludes minorities from fair representation, because obviously within a first past the post party system, parties will often put up candidates who are the least objectionable, whereas, because obviously it's all about getting votes, it's not about well, arguably it's not about representation. One that possibly isn't, no, it still is. It does exclude women from office, because even today, women in politics are they're severely underrepresented, and political leadership has always been like a male-dominated party. I mean, until the suffragettes campaigned to get women the vote, women had no influence in politics whatsoever. First past the post also leaves a large number of wasted votes, which don't actually go towards any candidate, and what did I say? it can make it can increase the likelihood of people uh, organizing anti-system regimes, so like an anti-system protests, as the protests that have been happening in London. Another problem with first past the post is that it is actually quite unresponsive to changes in public opinion, because you don't have that kind of general power. Because with first past the post, it's like, oh, we're the two main parties, yeah, so what? And so they don't really feel the need to address public opinion. Whereas within proportional representation, because each vote does actually matter, they're very much more responsive. And another problem with first past the post is it insists on the drawing of electoral boundaries. So obviously you've got the different electoral constituencies, and that can cause rather isolationist attitudes. Now, going on to proportional representation. Now, obviously the underlying rationale behind proportional representation is to consciously reduce the disparity between a party's share of the national vote and its share of parliamentary seats. Now, obviously that means that for however many votes they get, they should have that many seats. So, advantages to proportional representation. It avoids the plurality and majority systems, and it's also better able to produce a representative legislature, obviously. And it encourages the formation of, so within political parties or groups, it encourages like-minded individuals to come together. So, and that also clarifies policy, ideology, and stuff like that, because you've got people who agree on a lot of policies as opposed to just some of the policies. And another problem with first past the post is you get people who join the party simply because it's hard to stand as an independent within a first past the post system. It just is, because I mean, arguably, if you stand as an independent politician within a first past the post system, you're never going to get into government unless, like, faith in the leadership parties completely fails. It also obviously gives rise to very few wasted votes, which also increases the feeling of worth that voters feel, because a lot of voters within first past the post are like, oh, my vote's not going to make a difference, I'm not going to vote. Whereas in proportional representation, every single vote matters, so that gives rise to a more politically active community. It also allows minority parties representation, and obviously that ties in with the whole principle of inclusion, and arguably having minority parties represented is crucial to stability. It also encourages nationwide campaigning, because within first past the post you often get parties focusing on certain constituencies. I mean, you saw that with UKIP. I mean, they focused on Farage's home constituency and the other one where they actually won the seat. I can't remember what it's called. But they very much focus their efforts, whereas with proportional representation, because every single vote counts, it encourages nationwide campaigning. It's like, so you don't just, yeah. Another thing with proportional representation it actually leads to greater continuity and stability of policy, because I mean within first past the post you see it all the time with economics. Obviously with Labour and to take an example, with Labour and Conservative, they both have very different approaches towards our economical system, and obviously with 5-term parliaments there's not really much time for economic growth, because sometimes when the Conservatives put something into play, as soon as Labour comes in, they immediately reverse that, meaning that there's no kind of time then for economic growth. Now, I think Western Europe said this. Proportional representative systems generally score better in regard to governmental longevity, voter participation, obviously, and economic performance, because you always have those parties represented, because each vote counts. And, like, first past the post, as I've already said, can make economic growth difficult. Now, some of the disadvantages is it leads to it has a greater chance of a coalition government. However, I personally don't think that's a disadvantage, but it can be argued to be a disadvantage. But obviously, with coalition governments, is you have the problem legislative gridlock, where no one can agree, so nothing can be done. Which, yeah, another problem with proportional representation, well, another arguable problem with proportional representation is that it leads to representation of extremist parties. However, my argument against that is if a majority of the country, or if some of the country agree with that extremist party, then it should be represented in government, because we're supposedly a democratic system, so therefore our government should reflect the views of our people. I mean, I might not agree with some of the extremist parties. I mean, I don't agree with a lot of UKIP policies, but I would be okay that under proportional representation they would be the third largest party in government. In fact, I don't agree with them, but as Voltaire said, I might not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And if so much of the population agrees with UKIP, then that's how they should be represented in government. But that. Another argument which I actually think belittles the population is that proportional representation is difficult to understand. Now, obviously, the counter to this is that you educate your voters more, which actually brings me on to one of the things I'm quite passionate about. I think there should be greater political education in schools. I mean, most people don't start studying politics until they go to college, whereas I think it should be kind of introduced into the later years of secondary school. So obviously that mitigates that problem. And I mean, at the end of the day, we live in we're constantly told we live in a democracy. So therefore, we should have a government that reflects that. Shouldn't we? I mean, it makes sense to me. And I mean, I voted Lib Dem, and I did that because I agree with their policies. However, under a first past the post system, my vote didn't really make any difference, as evidenced by the disastrous outcome of the election. But proportional representation is definitely more democratic. The only problem with it is that it can lead to political stagnation, which is a bad thing. I'd argue that it's a bad thing. But within first past the post, you often have two major parties vying for power, and often their policies are juxtaposed to one another, and constantly jockeying for position and changing laws all the time is, in my opinion, no way to run a country. So, whilst I have reservations concerning proportional representation, it is ultimately the more democratic. So, yeah, I suppose the point of this video was to inform you as to that, and I shall leave you now. Again, if you want to hear me ramble on and on and on, subscribe to my channel. If not, I really don't blame you. So, thank you. Bye.